Hello, it's Miss Morgan, and it's time to be historified. Thank you, Helena T. from 2015-16 for that video start idea. This video will explain some of the key parts of Europe once Rome fell and what Europe was like in the early Middle Ages. You should have a writing utensil that's a different color from the one you use to do your notes, and you need to add to your notes and fix your notes if you miss something important that I say is important and that you need to have on your paper. And if at any point you need to pause the video to have enough time to fix your notes or add to your notes, then that's what you should do. Press that pause button. All right, so first up we have I mentioned the fall of Rome. Ignore the red writing at this point. But anyway, Rome had unified Europe, and so when Rome fell, this really hurt Europe. And you can see what I wrote to the side in green, and the lack of unity provided by Rome is what led to the chaos at the start of the Middle Ages in Europe. So the collapse of Rome led to the decline in several areas that First Fact says political, social, and economic decline after the collapse. So social decline is referring to the quality of life for people, that wasn't that great anymore in the early parts of the Middle Ages. So more examples of that are given for number 2, the fact there. And for this part here, number 3, there's 3 possible answers. I wrote them all and you just had to write 2. But I think for number 3, it would be good for you to highlight or circle the Dark Ages, that term, so that you see where the examples are that explain why that term came to exist. And remember, that term was not created during the Middle Ages, during this time period. It was actually created in the early Renaissance with someone who was looking back at the years in the centuries before the Renaissance, and in contrast to the Renaissance, this time period seemed dark. So the term Dark Ages can be debated, and it kind of depends what time of the Middle Ages you're thinking about and what part of Europe you're thinking about. And plus, it only refers to Europe. There were other civilizations at this time that weren't as dark and that were doing fine, like in China and in the Islamic world. So for 2 and 3 in this section, you should check your fill-ins. The Middle Ages and medieval civilization are referring to the same time period. So see how I highlighted that to the right? So those are interchangeable terms for this time period. In modern times, for number 2 is not considered 2016. It's around 1500. So the next section talks about like what some groups were able to do because Rome didn't exist anymore. So one group that conquered parts of the Roman Empire was the Franks, and you heard about them in the Dark Ages video that we watched, or that you watched in school. If you haven't watched that video yet, then you will be watching it soon. So this typed in information just gives you a little background about what life was like for Germanic tribes that conquered parts of the Roman Empire. The main group that we're going to focus on here is the Franks. So this information in the next section refers to Clovis. Okay, so you got to make sure if you wrote information that I had already typed in and you wrote it under A, the Franks extend their power, then you need to make sure you fix this section. So it tells you that Clovis conquered Gaul in 486, converted to Christianity because that was the religion of the people of Gaul, so you need to make sure you have that. And then a key fact here, like why did that conversion matter? And that is explained in my fact number 3. So was he inspired because Clovis thought Christianity was the only religion to be? Possibly not. It might have been a more strategic move that he knew would help his power. So before you move on to the next page, I want you to write the word unicorn in the lower left corner of the paper, so on the opposite side of the page number, and circle it. So write unicorn and circle that before moving on to page 2. So the top of page 2 talks about the Muslims, and we've already studied them, but this section will explain how the Muslims connected to the Franks. So Muslims were in North Africa and Spain. They were called Moors from North Africa. The ones from North Africa were called Moors, and they spread their rule into Spain. So they're getting closer to Europe, and that's why the Catholic Church and Christian leaders were worried, because the Muslims are getting closer and closer to land in Europe, and the Christians thought the Muslims were a threat to their power. So there was a battle that is mentioned in the Dark Ages video, the Battle of Tours. When the book says Charles Martel and the Franks beat Muslims in France, Charles Martel and the Franks are the Christians. So this is a battle, Christians versus Muslims. The Christians end up winning. So this was good for the Christians, obviously, because the Muslims didn't gain any more land in France or in Europe. The Christians saw this victory as a sign that God was on their side. So they kind of took the victory and saw it, the significance related. They connected the significance of the battle to religion. So they thought that this meant, their religion was better than the Muslim religion. They still felt threatened by Muslims, though, because the Muslims were in Spain. And later in history, about a few hundred years after this, the Christians in Spain are going to try to kick out all the Muslims, and they will eventually be successful in 1492. All right, so there's the conflict between Muslims and Christians during this time period in the Battle of Tours. Remember, pause the video if you need to catch up. So Charlemagne's also mentioned in the Dark Ages video. It may be helpful to highlight what I've highlighted, and also maybe the 46-year reign that he had. So he was one of the strongest leaders during the Middle Ages in Europe. So he had helped a Pope Leo, defeat rebellious nobles in Rome, and that led to the Pope crowning him as Emperor of the Romans. So that was, good for Charlemagne, and kind of was another way that he could be powerful, because he was allies with the Catholic Church, and he helped out the Catholic Church. The idea, by doing this, the Pope kind of brought back the idea of uniting Christianity. But this kind of had the reverse effect, because if you go down to topic B of this section, Eastern Roman Empire Emperor Outraged, this is talking about the Byzantine Empire, which we've already studied. So the Byzantine Empire Emperor was offended that Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans, because he thought he was the only Roman ruler. Remember, the eastern part of the eastern part of the Roman Empire did not fall like the western part did. So the Eastern Empire, which was the Byzantine Empire, centered around Constantinople, remained strong. It didn't fall apart like the West. So this crowning of Charlemagne actually divided the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, because the Eastern Roman Emperor thought he was better than Charlemagne, that Charlemagne was this backwards, uncivilized leader. All right, so in C, the important information here is that Charlemagne, as emperor, worked to spread Christianity and unite the Christian empire and make it stronger and bigger. And in the Dark Ages, it talks about how he did that, and sometimes he threatened people with death if they didn't convert to Christianity. So it wasn't always it was sometimes a violent method he used to get people to convert or scare them into converting. Before you move on to page 3, I want you to write narwhal, Narwhal, in the lower left-hand corner and circle that. On page 3, we have a section that goes contrary to the name Dark Ages, and it talks about why Charlemagne thought learning was important, what he did to bring it back. Okay, number 1's important, so make sure you have that fact on your paper, what he thought education could do. Number 2 talks about his educational status. He couldn't write, but he could read. And an important part of my number 2 fact deals with officials needing to keep accurate records and write clear reports. So make sure you have that information down. Local schools were created, and he wanted to revive Rome's glory by bringing Europe's best scholars there. So education was really important to him. So another thing that happened during his reign was that he had a scholar, Alcuin, who thought of using uppercase and lowercase letters. So and adding spaces between words and punctuation to show the meaning, which I've outlined for you. So if you look at all caps, you can read that. It's not that hard, but it's slower than the reading above it with capital letters, lowercase letters, punctuation, space between words, things like that. So I think that was interesting, and I'm sure you never thought, I wonder who first thought of lowercase letters. Well, now you know. You learned something new today. All right, back to the facts. The next section talks about after Charlemagne died, what Europe was like. Again, make sure if you wrote information that I had already given you that you fix your notes in 1 and 2. And when it says Charlemagne's legacy, it's just talking about like what was left behind once he had died. Like what kind of impact did he have on history? Okay, so it gives you there spreading Christianity and strong, efficient governments created, and he gave examples of how other rulers could rule, other medieval rulers. All right, so this last section talks about invaders that invaded parts of Europe, especially once Charlemagne had died, and Europe was a little weaker again. So the first group's the Muslims, which were mentioned on page 2 with the Battle of Tours. Okay. Then there's this group called the Magyars. They're in present-day Hungary. And they went to other Eastern Europe and then other parts of Western Europe, Germany, France, Italy. We have, you've probably never heard of them. Obviously, you've heard of the Muslims. And then the last group was the Vikings. So I bolded this question that's circled in blue here. So I wanted you to give that information. I wanted you to answer that question in number 5. That's why there was another number after number 5, because number 5 was supposed to answer this question, and number 6 is supposed to be other information about the Vikings. So if you wrote something about the Vikings bursting out of Scandinavia and whatever else the book says, I saw a lot of bursting out of Scandinavia. So that's a place where you want to think about, well, what are they meaning by bursting out of Scandinavia, and can I reword it so Miss Morgan doesn't see bursting out of Scandinavia like 70 times? Anyway, these were some negative actions of the Vikings. You heard about them in the Dark Ages video. And then some more positive actions are listed next. Okay, so they both had some negative actions and some positive actions, actually trading and exploring. So there were 2 sides to the Vikings, and the Dark Ages video just really told you about the looting and their boats being able to go on oceans and rivers, so that was significant. And they didn't really wear hats with the horns. Okay, so at number 6, I just give you lots of examples of how they had a more positive impact than looting and taking over people. So before you stop the video, write Kiwi in the lower left-hand corner, Kiwi, circle it, and that's all students. Remember, narwhals are real.